Hi folks, welcome to Crisco's Corner. Unfiltered commentary, and not your truth, the real truth. Please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, thank you for your support. Hi folks, welcome back. I saw a video on a channel that I watch. They had a pretty good, fairly good, I can tell the guy's a little bit left, but pretty good synopsis on the 1920 presidential election. And I think there's a lot of parallels to what goes on today. Let's just get to it. Now, as you can see here from the right, normally I don't use Wikipedia because they're garbage. But a lot of the numbers in the votes, even some of the text is somewhat decent for Wikipedia, even though Wikipedia is not normally used anymore. My understanding is for even papers in high school and college, they use Wikipedia as a source, automatically get thrown in the garbage because it is garbage. It was really good at one time, but I digress. Let's get on with this. 1920 election, huge turning point. This was the first election after the end of World War I. This is the first election where all 48 states had women voting in the presidential election. Now, there's some states, and most people tell you that women couldn't vote. Nonsense. There were quite a few states that allowed women to vote nationally, locally, i.e. your city councils, your mayors, your county representatives, your state representatives, and some federal, i.e. Congress and the like. But it was universal suffrage. This was the first presidential election. And you see here, it was Warren G. Harding from Ohio and James Cox from Ohio. And there was a lot of Ohio people came in the 20th century and just prior to the late 19th century. I think Ohio has the second largest number of presidents behind Virginia. Now, they use Woodrow Wilson as Virginia because that's where he was born. It's not where you were raised, it's where you were born. As you can see, it was quite a landslide. It was just horrendous. Over 60% to 34%. That, folks, is an ass whipping. I mean, a real bad ass whipping. Yeah, there was some third-party candidates that might have helped, but you're looking at 90, almost 95% right there. So the third-party candidates had zero effect. Let's look at the electoral map. I know that's, not looked at. And with the electoral map, it breaks it all down. You can stop the video if you want to see some details. The socialist, the prohibition, which made no sense at all because 1920 was the first year of the prohibition. Socialist Party, things like that. Prohibition, probably one of the biggest disasters and the only amendment to the Constitution ever be repealed. But it's interesting. It's definitely interesting. And there's the image there of the Electoral College. Now, those of you that are to the left that believe that the Democrats of old were really racist and Jim Crow, and they pushed slavery and defended it and went to war over it and blah, 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 blah. They all became Republicans, which is nonsense. But let's look at this. If you believe that, let's look at this map. And what you're saying is the parties switched. That the old school Democrats were the racists. So that includes all the blue states here. And there were 48 back then, not 50. And all the other states were the non-racist. So that means today that all the states here in the Northeast, California, Washington State, Oregon, all through here, we're all the racist states. the non-racist states that are today the racist states. If there was really a big switch, that means everything that's blue is now Republican and racist, and everything in orange is non-racist. I'm even trying to explain it, it gets confusing. Let me try that again. Everything in blue now is the racist area, and everything in orange now is the non-racist areas of the current United States, which we know is bullshit. It's just interesting how these guys, and the neat part about this map is we can go to, say, each individual state. And it's really interesting. There's New York. Now, I live here in Broome County in upstate New York, which is right here. That's my county. If we look at the chart here, it looks like about 60 to 70% Harding. It's not the dark red and it's not the light red, almost pink. So let's go back here and we can look at, say, we'll pick another state, which is kind of neat here. Let's pick Texas. Texas. All blue, which is Democrat. Harding's in the red and light red. Cox is in the blue. So that means Cox was racist. All these blue counties were all racist. Because back then, the Democrats were the racists. Before they turned into Republicans, that is. I just wanted to make that point at the beginning. Let's read a little bit about it. Held on November 2nd, 1920, was the first election held after the end of World War I. And the first election after ratification of the 19th Amendment. 19th Amendment, of course, we all know what that is, and we can stroll over it. The right to vote to all citizens based on sex and effect. Actually, there was a lot that said you didn't need an amendment because many states allowed voting for women, and nobody raised hell about it. Incumbent Democrat Woodrow Wilson privately hoped for a third term. Now, those of you that don't know, Woodrow Wilson had a major stroke. Nobody ever heard him speak in public after he had a stroke, to my knowledge. He was hoping for a third term to go against the norm of 2 terms. It was unheard of. But party leaders were unwilling to renominate the ailing and unpopular incumbent. Yeah, they used the excuse it was his health, but the fact of the matter is he was so unpopular, even his own party said no. If I recall, I think in one election, Wilson got 41%, because that was the time that Teddy Roosevelt had his third-party candidacy and split the vote. Former President Teddy Roosevelt had been the front-runner of the Republican nomination, but he died in 1919 without leaving an obvious heir to his progressive legacy. He was a much different progressive than today. He was actually, by today's standards, normal. With both Wilson and Roosevelt out of the running, the major parties turned to little-known dark horses. And you can stop there and read the rest. Harding as compromise candidate between the conservative and progressive wings of the party, and he clinched his nomination on the 10th ballot of the 1920 nomination. And there you have the breakdown if you wanted to see the exact totals. And here's the 1920 Republican nomination. Now, what's interesting about this, and you see Calvin Coolidge there, who became president on the death of Warren Harding. There was a huge fight over the nomination itself. And it went 10 ballots. It went 10 ballots. Finally, the Republicans picked Warren Harding of Ohio. Did they really like him a lot? No. He was kind of a doofus, to be honest with you. He had one of the most corrupt administrations in history, not the most corrupt. Grant might have done that, even though I'm a huge Grant fan. I don't think Warren Harding was corrupt. I just think the people that he picked were corrupt. Same with Grant. Picked very, very poor choices for personnel picks. And also, he couldn't keep it in his pants, so to speak. He had multiple affairs and children all over from out of wedlock. And you got to remember, this is the early 20th century, and that's a huge deal. Today, who gives a crap? The election was dominated by the American social and political environment after World War I. And you can read here, interesting enough, here's a little side tidbit. Harding all but ignored Cox in the race and essentially campaigned against Wilson by calling him a return to normalcy. Now, that was the fact that you had all kinds of upheaval during World War I. Wilson, of course, promised in his second term when he ran and won to not put the United States into World War I. And, of course, less than 2 months after he was sworn in, we were at war. He lied. He lied to get reelected. Big shocker. Return to normalcy was a term that they used that we want to go back to the way it was before the war, before these huge upheavals, before all this craziness. And, of course, that was the first year of Prohibition, which caused a lot more craziness, but that's a different issue for another time. And it was interesting. It was the largest popular vote percent margin in presidential elections since the unopposed re-election of James Monroe. Now, my understanding, Monroe was the only president ever not to have an opponent. And it's just amazing to me. I think socialist Eugene Debs here, he got 3.4% of the vote, and he was in jail at the time. He was in jail and got 3.4%, besides being in prison at the time. It was also the first election women had the right to vote, as I had stated. Both presidential nominees would eventually become president by a weird coincidence in their own. Harding would pass away in 1923 and be succeeded by Vice President Calvin Coolidge. A Democratic vice presidential nominee, FDR, would eventually win an unprecedented 4 consecutive terms. So let's look a little bit into this. And you can read some of this. There's a lot here. I think what it was, when I say there's similarities to today, it's because people wanted the craziness to stop. They wanted the Wilson administration and the 8 years it was in office, in my mind, was a frickin' disaster. Of the 20th century presidents, I put Wilson as the worst of the top 5, easily. Now, 3 of my presidents in the 20th century, I believe, were a disaster. Not just mediocre presidents or bad presidents. I mean a disaster. I think Wilson, FDR, and LBJ were 3 of the worst presidents of the 20th century, easily. They made government huge. They took away states' rights. It was a horrible thing. Government expanded dramatically. In fact, one of the things that they pushed in the Republican platform at the time was all the extra administration and bureaucracy that was put on because of the war. I mean, huge amounts of federal employees that were brought in because to manage the war, so to speak. And when the war was over, they stayed there. And government got exponentially larger. Same thing happened in World War II. You need extra government to fight a war? That's fine. But when the war is over, those people should be gone, and they weren't. And it exponentially grew again. And then LBJ, in his great society agenda, expanded the role and the size of the federal government dramatically again. And it's like doubling a penny. After a while, it becomes huge. I was really surprised that Cox did as poorly as he did. In fact, it was funny towards the end when he saw the poll numbers were slipping away for him. Cox started saying some derogatory things. You got to remember, things were different. There wasn't much media back then. There was radio, and there were newspapers. And, of course, there were local and state representatives of each party. They had their little meetings, their conventions. But you didn't get the widespread campaigning like you do now, even though Harding did what they call a front porch campaign, which means when he talked to the press and the media at the time, like I said, were radio and newspapers, he did from his front porch. Cox, on the other hand, traveled around. But for the most part, presidential candidates back then had their surrogates go around the country on behalf of their candidacy. And the one thing that I think pushed it more than anything was Wilson and the Democrats' embrace and FDR's embrace and James Cox's embrace of the League of Nations. And the Democrats would not compromise with the Republicans on the League of Nations. The biggest point that they objected to was the fact that, say, the countries that are in the League of Nations, i.e. today's United Nations, which is a freaking disaster, the League of Nations had the authority by vote of its members to enter into a war against another country. So that means other nations could draw America into another war again. And after the bloodbath of World War I, very high casualties, very similar to the high casualties in the American Civil War, because the tactics were behind the weapons. The weapons were much more deadlier, much more efficient at killing, and they used the same tactics. Christ, they had horses in World War I. And that's when the tanks first started coming and modern warfare started. In fact, a lot of people think that Lee's entrenchment around Petersburg at the end of the Civil War was just a training for World War I with this massive trench warfare. And it was millions killed. It was unbelievable. It was a bloodbath never seen before, and people wanted no part of it. It wasn't American isolationism, even though that's what the Democrats say now, and that's where I think the similarities are. Basically, the Republicans at Harding were America first. And the Democrats, with James Cox as their candidate, was America in league with the other nations, i.e. the League of Nations. I remember when I was in junior high school, we had a big fake League of Nations thing. We pretended we were senators. And I ended up being a reporter. I got picked to be a reporter. And it was interesting. One set of students picked for the league in Wilson's. I forget how many points there was. 14? I don't recall. Wilson's 14 points in the League of Nations. And then we had a group of students that were anti-League of Nations. It took autonomy away from the United States. Does that sound familiar to you? How about the World Trade Organization? How about the TTP? They ended up getting killed after it got exposed. That's what's happening now. The Democrats have always been, even back then as they are today, 101 years later, a century later, still advocates for not America first. So this isn't anything new. And this is why I think the comparisons are great. Was Warren Harding some kind of mental giant? And, he wasn't. He wasn't an idiot either, but he had about the personality of an egg, okay? In all fairness. And we can go through here, and you can stop some of the video. And it gives you some of the numbers. There is the final totals there. And if you see the numbers on top, they're the number of times that the convention voted for its candidate. And finally, Warren Harding. Now, to give you an idea here, this is the first presidential ballot. I'll tell you how ridiculous it was. And as you can see from the color coding, you want to stop the video, who was for what? And this is the Republican National Convention. And then we see the second presidential ballot. Not much has changed. And then the third. You got to remember, this is in the dead of summer. I forget where it was. I think it might have been in Chicago. I'm not sure. If I remember right, there's a scene in the TV series Boardwalk Empire where Nucky Thompson goes to the convention and finagles it around to help Harding get the nomination. But that's a show. And they can twist history around and make it fit a narrative. But so we get the fourth, not much change. Fifth, not much change. Sixth, not much change. If you notice, Puerto Rico had some delegates there as well as the Philippines, Hawaii, and Alaska, even though Hawaii and Alaska were territories. And here we go, the 7th and the 8th. Actually, if you look at it, Ohio here in the yellow is Warren Harding. That's his home state, Ohio. He slowly picked up. And then the 9th, here we go. They made a deal. And all the yellow there now becomes Harding. Colorado, Nevada, Utah, Texas, Oklahoma, most of the South all went for Harding. And as before, they went for Loudon. And they wanted a compromise candidate, and they got one. It was pretty much assured that whoever the Republican nominee was going to be the president. And there it is, the 10th and final before the shifts, and that's after. So it went from right here having 35 to having all of them. The only ones that stayed, Loudon, if I look at here, ends up with 0. And I'll take that back. He's got a 3, 6, 7, 11. And that's the way it went. And it was very, very interesting, very interesting. And I use the example that it's the same because they're blaming the fact that the Democrats pretty much had political control in the highly urban areas with a lot of Irish immigrants. And the Irish immigrants almost exclusively voted Democrat up until that point. And they just didn't want Cox. They just didn't want him. And so basically, they threw the people under the bus. And we go through some of there's a quote in here that basically says anybody with a hyphen in their name, i.e. Irish American, Italian American, African American, anybody with a hyphen. This is the Democrats talking now. Anybody with a hyphen in their name is their race or national identity from where they lived prior to immigrating to the United States or first generation were basically traitors. It's the damnedest thing. And things haven't changed much. They haven't changed at all. The Democrats still think people from certain ethnic backgrounds, race, certain things like that were the problem. If they didn't vote their way, then they were traitors. It's really fascinating stuff. And I'll scroll down here, and you can stop the video and read some of this. Even though this is Wikipedia, it's fairly accurate, oddly enough. And here you see here, and that's by county. You see on the right there. It's funny they have a cartoon here. Anyhow, there are worse places than a front porch because Harding supposedly ran a front porch campaign, and that is Eugene Debs, who ran under the Socialist Party for years, ended up getting over 3% of the vote from jail. And it's really interesting. And we'll go through here, and it lists all what they had percentage-wise, what party, the single tax party, the Socialist, American Prohibition, Farm Labor Socialist, Democrat, Republican. And it's really fascinating stuff. It really is. It's the same argument we're having now. America first, or America is part of a world globalist. And it's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Kentucky was close, as you can see. Tennessee was the first southern state to vote for a Republican since Reconstruction, since the war. And it's just fascinating stuff. So I just wanted to show you that this argument concerning America first and not being a globalist, they called isolationism, and it's not. It's America first. We look out for our people first, and everything else is secondary. It's not anything new. And as we all know, Warren Harding went on to win by a huge margin. And he died in 1923. Getting 60% is a big deal. He died in 1923, and Calvin Coolidge, as the vice president, succeeded him. And then Calvin Coolidge ran for another term. And it's really fascinating. It's fascinating stuff how everybody thinks this is something new. Even if you hate or love Donald Trump, the issue is America first. Our workers, our services, our farmers, our factory workers, people that work in the service industry, and people that produce products in manufacturing, and all the things that make America run and other countries run as well, is nothing new. They were going to sell out, in my opinion, the Democrats were going to sell out America's sovereignty to the League of Nations, and people saw through that. Just like what's going on now. Just like with the World Trade Organizations are selling out, and our politicians allow it. It's amazing to me. But in this case, the only difference between then and now is the fact I think both sides of the aisle have sold out the American workers. Mostly the Democrats, I would say about 2/3 of the Republicans. And that's why Trump was hated by the Republicans. It's tough when you have the entire opposition party hates your guts. In Trump's case, they want you killed, your body burned, and your ashes sent into space, for Pete's sake, or something similar. And half, if not a little bit over half, of the party you represent wants you gone too. But he managed to pull it off. He pulled the inside straight. I'm not going to go into detail on the election of 2020 because this video will be taken down on YouTube. You can all fill in the blanks from the other, hopefully, sources that you have that tell the truth. And we're going to see in the next year when it really comes, because I don't think the issue's over, but we'll see. But anyway, I want to bring up the fact that history repeats itself. And that's the old saying. People that ignore history, I forget exactly how the saying goes. If you ignore history, you're doomed to repeat it. Yeah, here we are. It was at the end of a major war. The Americans, their economy was wrecked in a lot of ways. And now they wanted to bring back jobs. They wanted to bring the economy up. And the Democrats want to put us into a world globalist society, so to speak. And the Republicans said no. So more things change, the more they stay the same. Anyway, folks, just wanted to bring that up. And there he is, the winner of the presidential election of 1920, Warren G. Harding. And that's the history on that. I thought it was fascinating. If you look up on YouTube, there's a lot of videos on the 1920 election that go into a lot more detail. I don't usually write a script when I do my episodes like a lot of people do. Maybe I should. I kind of wing it as I go along. But that's the way it went. So, those of you that are out there want to look up things, just don't go to Wikipedia, of course. Go through the internet and try to weed through the crap. Find out what history really was, not what they say it is. It's the same over and over and over. What happened? Well, Warren Harding died. Calvin Coolidge was president. And then on and on and on. Herbert Hoover. And then the Great Depression, of course. And then Roosevelt, World War II. We were back to conservative again in the 50s. Same pattern over and over. What will happen this time? We'll see. But I think it's out of our hands. People are people, whether it's 1920 or 2020. Human nature will never change. And that's the one thing Republicans and conservative people know. And Democrats think that society can change human nature. And they've always thought that. And we had the same differences back then as we do now. But we'll see in the upcoming midterms. That will be a good indication of which way the country is going. and where it might end up for the next generation. Sorry I was a little long-winded, but I just wing these things. I don't have a script. And until next time, folks, goodbye and good luck.